couple of people recently have asked me if I would give a summary of my books with recommendations as to where to start. I began in about 1970. I wrote a novel called Johnston's 20th Century Occult Philosopher and Skeptical Politic Theorist, which was never published, and the follow-up to it was a series of essays called Uncle Ramsey's Bumper Book of Magic Spells. So I wanted to write something and get it out there. But it wasn't until the mid-70s when a friend asked me to write an essay on magic for a collection he was doing, which would have several essays, and one of them would be on Western magic. And the book I wrote, or the article I wrote, the book fell through, but I realized that I had an article which I could expand a bit and publish myself as a little book. This was SSOT-BME, an essay on magic, its foundations, development and place in modern life, which really explains what I was trying to present in that. Magic as I had experienced it in Britain, and what its relevance was. Now, I was very chuffed when Gerald Suster liked the book, and he introduced it to the people, like Peter Carroll, Ray Sherwin, who were going to become the Chaos Movement. And he described it as the book that put the magic back in magic. And I asked him what he meant by that, and he said that in the 50s and 60s, the main sort of magical thinking was on the lines of Diane Fortune, W.E. Butler, very much an emphasis on the inner psychological working. But my book had pointed out the extent to which your inner ideas, how much they actually impact the outer world around. And so it sort of pointed the way to the revival of results magic and then chaos magic. That book, I only did 500 copies, but they're sold eventually, and so there was a second British edition. But probably what became better known was the American edition, which had an Austin Spare cover also on the cover, picture on the cover, done by my partner in publishing. And that became the basis for a republished, revised version, Sesopne Revised, an essay on magic, which is the one which is currently available as a Kindle book and as a print-on-demand paperback. And I usually recommend that as a starting point for someone, because I think, as Gerald Suster recognized, this is a book which helps you to get into the right mindset for then studying magic in all its many forms. That it's very basic in that sense, and yet in that way it is also a practical book, because it tells you how to get your thinking in line for magic. After I did the Abramelin operation, I wrote the next book, which was Thundersqueak by Angerford and Lee. Now, it's harder to describe Thundersqueak. I'll tell you what one person wrote about it. This was Kate Hulu in occultibooks.com. This is a book to turn you into many things. It's hard to know where to start. I agree with that. I suppose at pinch it could be called a self-help book, as there are instructions inside that you can follow, and by doing so make your life better, or at least more interesting. And perhaps happier even, if, quote, the only true happiness is to live dangerously in times of peace, and to be at peace in times of danger. But New Age fluffy it is not. This is a self-help by psychic self-surgery. It tears yourself to bits and chucks out the crap. I've also heard it described by a number of people as a good book to read when you're feeling angry, because it addresses that sort of teenage rage one can feel at the world, and I suppose gives ideas as to how to cope with that in a magical way. It has also been described as a particularly fine introduction to the practical side of the occult. Thundersqueak could almost be regarded as one of the texts of chaos. surprising to me because I didn't see it as a practical book. I saw it more as an outpouring of my own feelings at the time. And that is now available. It's a facsimile of the original, but it is available as a print-on-demand book from Amazon. Then, having sort of struggled to sell these, going around little bookshops and things, I had a hankering to write a book which a normal publisher would take and sort of get onto the shelves of bookshops and everything. And so I wrote Words Made Flesh, which was an exploration of the idea, artificial intelligence, humanity, and the cosmos. It was an exploration of the idea that we could be living in a virtual reality. Now, this was a very radical idea, which I proposed since 1972 or so. But I'd published articles about it in the 80s. This was the first full exploration of that. When I published this version in 1986, there wasn't, the term virtual reality wasn't extant. But when I republished it in 2000, I put that into the subtitle, Virtual Reality, Humanity and the Cosmos. Now, in some ways it's a dated book because the idea that we're living in virtual reality since the film Matrix towards the end of the 90s has become a fairly well-known idea. And it is based on the same statistical argument I gave back in the early 80s in terms of, if there was a virtual reality universe, it would result in many other virtual copies of that virtual reality universe. And so it's extremely unlikely that we happen to be living in the original one. And therefore, we're probably living in a virtual reality. I mean, that was the argument which I called Johnston's paradox. Now, the thing that makes that book worthwhile still is that whereas a lot of talk has been done about are we living in a virtual reality, the point I made is more that whether we are or not, if we start to think that we're living in a virtual reality, it would have a serious impact on magic, on society, on religion, and these are things which I expand on and discuss in that book. And I'm not aware of any other virtual reality theorist having worked on that in the same extent. So the book still has value. Then, towards the end of the 80s, I was approached by the 23 press, which was Topi, Temple of Psychic Youth, and they wanted to publish something of mine, and so I said, well, I've got these various articles that were published during the 80s, including the ones on virtual reality, and they could be collected into a book. And when I gave them the material, it was clear it was much too big for one book, and so they published Last Your Way to Megabucks, My Secret Sex Power Formula by Ramsey Dukes, with the subtitle and Other Reflections Upon the Spiritual Path. And that book I felt was a bit dated because it was earlier essays, but it did have some very good ones in it, like the Charlatan the Magus, which I referred to in other things. And that is still available in my edition of it, which is print on demand, and you can get on Amazon. And some people say some of their favourite essays are in that book. Then, in the 90s, Carl Abrahamsson in Sweden was going to publish the rest of my essays up to date. And he started laying it out and everything, and then he got held up with a lot of other projects, so I took it over. So what I did on my holidays, essays on black magic, Satanism, devil worship, and other niceties, with a wonderful Austin Square cover, only came out in the late 90s. And again, I have, when that was sold out, I republished it myself as a print-on-demand book, and you find that on Amazon. Also in the 90s, I wrote another book, The Good, the Bad and the Funny, by Adamai Philotunis, with the considerable subtitle De Arcana Nostro Sanctissimae Mirabilisqui Trinitatis eas Protestenti Senandi et Redimendi Vim Statistis et quae excoginatio eas contributionis ultimae ad magisterium magicae artis nostra addita est. I was really playing up the alchemical bit on this, but the point of that book is the extent to which we are trapped in dualistic thinking and also fourfold thinking. Give the example of alchemy. Many people think of alchemy, well, that's lead into gold, isn't it? You know, the bad, the good, lead, gold. And if they know a bit more, they say, oh yes, there's the four elements, earth, air, fire and water. Now that duality, lead, gold, good, bad, God, devil, is so ingrained in our thinking that it causes a lot of problems. I think a lot of people recognize that. But the argument was, oh, we need to find the middle way. And I said, no, what we need to find is a third principle. Because if you think in twos, you tend to get into a battle situation. If you think in fours, you tend to get into stereotyping. Earth, air, fire, water. What type are you? But if you think in threes, and in alchemy that's sulfur, salt, mercury, which is equivalent of the astrological cardinal fixed mutable, it's actually about a continuing process. And the same with the threefold goddess. It is not three different types of goddess. It is a growing up and transmuting, a cyclic transmutation of the goddess. And so this book is really an exploration of how one might get into thinking in threes and looking for sort of threefold examples. How the third principle, the mercurial one, is like the trickster principle. I mean, I give many, many examples. For instance, one of the splits in our society is rich versus poor. And I suggested education as the third alchemical principle, which can transmute between those states, and so on and so forth. So that's the good, the bad, the funny, which again, I published it myself as an e-book, and then it became available as a print-on-demand one, like the others. Now, following that, I was actually asked by a publisher to write something, and that was Aeon Books. And I wrote for him Little Book of Demons. In the original, it came out as Uncle Ramsey's Little Book of Demons, but now it's just the Little Book of Demons. The Positive Advantages of the Personification of Life Problems. Now, this is closer to what I think of as a practical book, because it is about how to tackle these problems in your life by personifying them, speaking to them as beings, as demons. And that book is available, I think it's available as a Kindle and as an ordinary book, paperback book on Amazon. And later I did one for him called How to See Fairies, which I haven't got a copy of it to show you. But that is my most practical book ever, because it is a simple series of exercises, gradation, on how to develop clairvoyance if you are not naturally very clairvoyant. It is based on a course I did for an arcanorium, which was called Experimental Clairvoyance for the Non-Psychic, and that just about sums it up. And the people who did it did see fairies. Now, I hadn't published anything myself for many years, and I'd always, as with Words Made Flesh, I wanted to write something which would be published in general press and speak to a bigger audience. And that is the book which I was struggling with and eventually done myself, and that's the one which has just come out, My Years of Magical Thinking. So, should you begin with that book or with SSOT BME Revised? It depends. This book, My Years of Magic Thinking, goes further than SSOTBMD in explaining how my ideas developed, what their inspiration was. But they both cover a lot of the same ground. The new book goes much further. If you just wanted a sort of to get into the mindset of magic and to so that you could then go on and read other books, then SSOTBME Revised, it says, is a good introduction. It sort of points you in the right direction, if you like. If you're really into, if one of the reasons you're studying magic is your life is up against a brick wall and you're feeling a lot of rage and that, then Thunder Squeak, it's hard for me to recommend, but many people would say that's the book to read next. I think after Sesopony. Then, if you're fairly into playing with different ways of looking at the world and that, and realize the extent to which dualistic thinking is a limitation, the good, the bad, the funny, I'd say that's when to read that. Words Made Flesh, again, does the same thing. It's a different way of looking at the world, which for some people is very liberating to see the world in terms of virtual reality. And I present that as an exercise. And it is a good magical model, the information model. As to my books of essays, I would say leave those until you've read Sesopony, and if that type of thinking agrees with you, then many people are very fond of those books, and they say that some of the best material is in those books. It's very varied, magical topics, but around magic, I would say, rather than being pure essays about magic. I think that How to See Fairies is actually a very good practical book, and I recommend it for people who say, I'm interested in magic, but where do I start? I've never done anything like this. It is really a very practical book, and introduces how to get into things like tarot reading and clairvoyance and that in a simple step-by-step way. I think it does better than many of the other books, which tend to sort of throw you into the world of mystery. Whereas this says this is how you start. And I think I should just say a word about the books I'm going to produce. My next book, which I've started editing, is my Abramelin Diary, which I hope will come out this year. That'll be done by Aeon Books, and I'll add a foreword about several introductions about the history of it, how I came across it, and what it has done for me in my life. I used to wonder what was the point of reading someone else's magical diary, but I enjoyed the John Syndron ones of Aleister Crowley, and I even got something out of George Chevalier's one, though I feel mine has got much more detail in it and says more than his. The other easy books for me to do, I was thinking of making transcripts of my various videos and having them as like a collection of essays under headings. That's an easy one to do. But also, I have got other Arcanorium courses from the past that I could make into little books, rather as I did for How to See Fairies. So that's the immediate publishing prospects I have. And so for someone saying, where do I begin with magic? I do quite recommend SSOTBME or My Years of Magical Thinking to sort of see if it gets you into the right frame of mind, and if you find that agreeable and working for you, then I would say read whatever you like. There's a hell of a lot of stuff on the shelves, Mind, Body, Spirit and Magic and that. And those books will give you, I think, the right approach to it. And then after that, take your pick of my books.